Ooh. Hi, everybody. You may remember last show, but one we did an evening with the PM, and we had ex-Young Earth creationists who've seen the light, and we had quite a bit of interest. So we had a really good first show with the three guests last time, and I'm pleased to say we've got the second half of the show, the other three guests joining me today. So we have Tim, Blake, and Eden, who very kindly offered to share their stories and give a bit of insight into what they used to believe and how they've seen the light, so to speak, and accepted evolution alongside their faith. So welcome, guys. I will just introduce you as per the bios, and then we can have hopefully a good conversation. So Tim Fink. So Tim is a graphic artist and investment advisor living in Minnesota with his wife and youngest son. In high school, he became a born-again Christian and soon accepted young earth creationism, to which he held for several decades. In later years, he came to re-examine many young earth creationist claims, and he changed his mind, now accepting evolution as God's means of developing his creation. Blake Simpson Blake is a musician. He's a producer, songwriter, and 22-year career Christian missionary. Having concurred with young earth creationism for the first period of his life, for the first 14 years of his Christian faith, he retains a perspective that allows him to see the various sides of the issue while embracing mainstream science. Having lived for many years in Venezuela and Panama, he and his wife currently reside in Bozeman, Montana. And Eden Johnson. Eden is a math and biology teacher currently taking an extended hiatus from her career after her and her husband's 6-year-long IVF journey ended with a huge joy of a newborn son. Eden herself had secular parents, including an agnostic father, who immersed her from birth in STEM topics, which became a crisis when Eden became the first Jesus follower in her family at the age of 12. Reaching for something to try to win her dad to Christ, she found creation science books in middle school and was surprised when her dad pointed out errors and inconsistencies in the material instead of just getting saved. Eventually, as an adult, she admitted to herself that she knew evolution was true and found at that juncture she had great ease and joy integrating that with her faith in Christ. So, great bios, guys. Thank you. And a lot there already to unpack, but it just shows what an interesting world it is and how changes in perspective can really edify us and enlighten us. Um, so let's start with Tim as we go around the order of the screen. So Tim, several decades as a young earth creationist.
Yes. From my time in graduating from high school all through probably into my apparently into my 50s. So I think it was around probably about 11, 12 years ago that I was struggling with the ideas and concepts from that. So it's been a while. Yeah. So
And in terms of re-examining the way you see claims that change your mind, was that through online communities or books or a combination of both or videos? What was it that
well,
was influencing you at the time to suddenly make you think it might not be right?
well, let me talk a little bit about my background. I was pretty strongly into young earth creationism more than other average Christians who just kind of assume it or whatever.
Hmm.
I would study it, and I ended up, I believe in 1982. That might take us a ways back. I attended a full creationism conference at a local Christian college, and there I met. I don't know if you're familiar with Barry Setterfield. There, he was a creationist astronomer who came up with his theory of the change in the speed of light to explain the age of the universe. And at that point, I got his tape series and I got his white paper at the time. Although I handle theory well, I don't do the math. So, but anyway, at the time I was always thinking, gosh, with all of the things they're discovering here, the young Earth creationists are putting forth. Um, it won't be long before they start seeing problems in the evolutionary theories and in all of the way they see scientists are going to come up against with all the brick walls, you might say, in how things work, and they'll have to acknowledge, young Earth and all of that. Well, that didn't happen, of course, and um, so back at that time, I was thinking, well, whatever happened to things like Barry Setterfield's theory and other ideas? And that's why I did go online hunting these things down, found out, yeah, been debunked years ago, um, found out how and all that. And then I just continued to investigate further. It was a lot of online community and websites and stuff that I looked at. But it was a good thing to know that they were backed by scientific, scientists and research and stuff that was very verifiable. Um, and that started breaking the possibilities open. So for me,
And one thing I wanted to ask, and I'll ask all of you this because it's one of the most interesting parts of it for me, as someone who's not ever believed in young Earth creationism, but has taken a big interest in it, and particularly the psychology of belief, is when you did subscribe to it and you would call yourself a young Earth creationist, can you just explain emotionally, psychologically, even intellectually to a point, what it felt like? Did you Because I'm trying to establish whether I've been on Answers in Genesis recently, trying to have a few discussions with some of the guys there, and it's a bit like hitting a brick wall. But
hmm.
it's the extent to which people actually believe it, and they genuinely believe this stuff, and they're trying their best to convince everybody else, and there's no internal dissension or internal shame, or whether it's that deep down they know that there must be something up with this belief, but there's such there are sunk costs, their reputations at stake, particularly people with high profiles like Ken Ham and people like that. So when you believe this stuff, what internal stuff was going on for you? Were you, internally in dissension with self-doubt, or did you actually fully believe it and were wholly convinced by it?
Well, for me, I think there's an extent of ignorance, part of it. I remember, I mean, I was very much into science in many ways growing up. I remember um, my first book when I was in grade school was a scholastic book, a publication of Roy Chapman Andrews in the Days of the Dinosaurs. And of course, I immersed myself in dinosaurs and stuff as my favorite uh, animals and topics for all my youth. So it was a change actually to go from old Earth and evolution to young Earth creationists in the first place. But that was, um, I would say, um, peer group was one of the reasons why. I was in a Bible study group, and that's when I was introduced to it, and it seemed plausible, and you know, uh, my new cultural environment very much encouraged it, and it just seemed convincing. Even though I'd immersed myself in science and other things, there was reasons why I chose to believe it because it was, faithful to God's word, it seemed. Okay. And seemed,
Hmm.
well, it's got to be right that way then.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah.
I think
Go ahead.
like in my young years as a believer, like I wasn't given any options for how to believe in God and not believe in young earth creationism.
Yeah.
So um no, I was never really steeped in all the arguments in science, because every time I tried to touch, like, every time I tried to touch this science of creation science, I would just run into all sorts of things that were wrong. Like, I was never really convinced by the books and stuff, because my dad was always right there telling me, like, look at all these errors that they put in their book, and they knew what they were doing. They're scientifically minded enough to be able to write this stuff. They know they're lying. And that was like really difficult. And so, like, I never really bought into the so-called science side of it, but the belief that this has to be right, we just haven't gotten to the right arguments yet. Because I wasn't, I knew that I believed in God, I knew I believed in Jesus, and I knew I believed in the Bible, and I didn't really have any other place to go with it, so, and it actually got to the point where the more I tried to, find evidence for creation science, the more my faith was being shaken. And I literally had to just like put it on the back burner for like a really long time. So I'd say for myself, I spent a few decades as a young believer just being like, I don't know what to do with that. Like, I
Mm.
cou- I couldn't acknowledge that I knew how science worked, and that I believed in evolution. I couldn't acknowledge that because, first of all, that would have been to just, in my mind, like, renounce the Bible, which I certainly wasn't going to do. And and then even when I started to see how I could actually hold on to the Bible and be true to what I knew was true, um, then the peer pressure thing kicks in. Then
Mm.
it took a while before I could actually speak openly about the fact that I knew evolution was true. Um, and and as I started to like unravel that, I actually became excited about it. Like, there was something really beautiful about seeing how things are not quite as they seem when you read the Bible. Like, if you're so used to being like a literalist, and suddenly you're like given this new lease on life where you can read the Bible with a lot more freedom, it's really exciting. And
Yes, absolutely.
yeah, and there's beauty in just seeing like God's creation through the lens of evolution, like, to see just like, oh, the fractals, and like, like,
Yeah.
seeing how things actually have come into being is much more grandiose and mysterious and beautiful, I think, than the fairy tale version of it. Can I say that? Um, but you know, but I wasn't allowed to say that. Like, when I first stepped out a little bit, it's like you've got to really have all your ducks in a row before you say anything, because you get hammered. Everybody wants to know, how on earth could you possibly think that? Because, there's just so much fear. Like, there's so much fear of like, don't believe this, that there's just all this propaganda built up around it. So, if you accept evolution, you're headed to atheism, you're headed to communism, you're a Marxist,
Mm.
Hitler, I don't know, but like, it's just, there's so much baggage of like how villainous it is to believe, I shouldn't even say believe, but to accept evolution. Um, so you have to get through all that. You have to get through the fact that creation science is given to you as like this supposed lifeline that's going to help you hold on to your faith in the face of a world telling you that you can't just read Genesis as a history book. And if you don't have a grid for, well, how can you believe in Genesis without reading it as a history book, then you're really stuck.
Mm.
And so you're, you know, trying to hold on to this lifeline, and this lifeline is like slipping. Like, so
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because as I meet young Earth creationists, particularly from the States, over the years online, yeah, I think the point you raised about for them, for many of them, they've really never seen an alternative, at least for a lot of their life. And when they start to get exposed to the alternative arguments, they're in this sort of kind of hermetically sealed discourse because they have nothing else other than, well, that must be wrong, and that's a threat to our belief. And if you've been brought up that way, it must be really hard to extricate yourself from that, which is why I think these conversations are fascinating, and why the last one was too, because it's really interesting to meet people who've moved away from that. I'm not saying you guys were as indoctrinated as some of these guys, but it's certainly an interesting journey. And the other thing, as you rightly say too, is that my experience of what you might call new wave atheism, and the wave of people that are leaving the faith and proclaiming that atheism is this kind of injection into reason and rationality and enlightenment. It's clear to me that the vast majority of them, from what I can see online particularly, are people who've been brought up in a relatively fundamentalist Christian upbringing. They may possibly even more fundamentalist than just young earth creation, but certainly, as you say, the things that are causing them to throw the baby out with the bathwater seem to have their origins in a quite fundamentalist religious upbringing.
Well, let's see
And I
if we
think that,
can.
sorry, just to finish, I think that's why these conversations are so important, because it's having a massively negative impact on the Christian faith, the reputation of it, the journeys of people who are faced with this kind of, well, if evolution is true, then my faith must be wrong. So yeah, I think that's it's telling as to how important these conversations are. Blake.
Yes, well, I'll try to keep it as succinct as possible because it's going to take 14 hours. I was raised Roman Catholic, but I was a very scientifically minded child, and my grandmother took note of this and gave me two big golden books of science. One was about scientists from Archimedes up through Madame Curie, etc. The other was about birds, because I was a little amateur ornithologist. And the book asked the question, which came first, the bird or the egg? Answer, the reptile came first. Now, I'm 7 years old, and I accepted that at face value. They explained evolution, and I didn't question it. Then I grew up in the 70s, and the Jesus movement happened. The hippies were getting saved, and the fallout of that kind of ultimately swept me along. I suffered from a lot of the musician maladies, particularly drugs and rock and roll, and discovered that I'd made a mess of my life. And I was surrounded by people saying Jesus is the answer, and I'm a good Catholic kid, but a lot the gospel got to me. I played in the pit orchestra for Godspell, and I was hearing the book of Matthew every night, and it's just started to get in my system. And I finally got to the point where I started to I feel an allegiance with Jesus and want to follow him, but I had this nagging suspicion that my evolutionary inclinations somehow were incompatible with Christianity. And I walked into the grocery store that day and found a book on the Christian rack called Answers to Tough Questions About the Christian Faith by Josh McDowell and Don Stewart. And there was a couple little blurbs about why evolution was wrong and all of that. And to me, that was the lifeline. Oh, okay, there are rational explanations for this, because, one was presented with the Bible is completely literally true. And I glommed onto this. I got into an evangelical church and got sent to Bible camp. It was glorious. And a guy that brought me there showed me the book table and said, pick out anything you want. And one of the books was Evolution, The Fossils Say No by Dr. Duane Gish from the Institute for Creation Research in El Cajon, which is where I'm from originally. And I didn't even have to so much read the book like page by page, but rather I just had this really scientific looking book that argued that the fossil record argues against an old Earth and against macroevolution. And for the next 14 years, as I joined Youth with a Mission, became a missionary, started roaming all over the world, I had it in my head that the reason people weren't Christians was because they believed in evolution. And I would start arguments about the age of the earth, which somehow I had confused with the gospel. The gospel is that Christ has died, risen, and will come again and gives us reconciliation with God. But somehow I had it in my head that the reason people weren't Christians was because of this horrible conspiratorial thing. And I still liked science, but 14 years into my Christian walk, my wife had a friend whose father was the professor of physics at Purdue University in West Lafayette, Indiana, Dr. Paul Sims. And so I met this nuclear physicist, and he was showing me around the particle accelerator at Purdue University. And I don't know how it came up, but I made some sort of a crack about the age of the earth or the universe or something. And this wonderful, gentle Christian gentleman brought me up short and very lovingly explained to me how the latest scientific findings actually support an old creation. And he gave me a book by Dr. Hugh Ross, the Creator and the Cosmos. And Dr. Ross is a Canadian geek who I think he has a lot of reservations about evolution, but not so much about the age of the universe. I read this book, and this was about the time I moved to Venezuela to do Christian work there. And I lived there for 9 years. But over the course of the next 9 years, I made this transition to being an old Earth creationist, and I also discovered intelligent design. I was really intrigued by the findings of Michael Bay, and I would actually teach this stuff in YWAM schools in Latin America in Spanish, showing the mechanism of the flagellum of an E. coli bacteria with the U joint and the electrostatic motor and everything. And I embraced irreducible complexity and all of that. And to this day, I think that intelligent design asks good questions. Whether it reaches the right conclusions is another matter. But I don't blame them for at least asking those questions. But finally, I moved to Panama after 9 years in Venezuela, and my son's science teacher gave me Dr. Collins' book, The Language of God. And that kind of pushed me the rest of the way over the brink into being able to embrace natural selection as God's method of creating. Now, I still have some questions because and they're scientific questions. This has nothing to do with the Bible or whatever. I like bats. As C.S. Lewis would say, I like bats better than bureaucrats. And I back when I first got saved, I was actually I'm a cartoonist. I was writing a book, a comic strip about how evolution was wrong, and I had this scientist named Dr. Ned Peppermoth explaining the mechanism by which Pre-Chiroptera, which was an ugly little creature, the only thing it had in common with bats was the ugly face, and how I went to great lengths to show it evolving into Semi-Chiroptera, a half-evolved bat. And I don't know why even real scientists say Chiroptera instead of Chiroptera. Drives me bananas. Anyway, the transitional forms were always a stumbling block for me in accepting natural selection as the mechanism by which we got where we are today, which is actually Monday morning, very early in the United States. Bottom line is that transitional forms do turn up when I was still kind of old Earth creationist, intelligent design, I saw on the cover of National Geographic a feathered dinosaur unearthed in China, and I managed to be skeptical about that because it looked ridiculous to me. But they do turn up in the fossil record, and that shows me
I,
that anything could turn up.
I remember just reading all this stuff about how, nobody's ever found a transitional form, right? And, then I'd go down to the Museum of Natural History. I live near Philadelphia, and I'd be in the Museum in Philadelphia of Natural History, and I'm like looking right at a transitional form, like it's this fish amphibian thing, and I'm like, wait a minute, there's one right here. Why don't they know about this? Like, but of course they just would always brush off anything as, well, that's not truly a transitional form. You need something in between that and the other thing, so they're always moving the bar. But
So
Yeah,
the
every time you find a new transitional
yeah.
form, it creates two more gaps, doesn't it? So
Right.
so they're very cunning, yes.
But but I mean, when I started kind of coming out about evolution in my Facebook world, like, I have friends that are pastors that really took me to task on it. And I think the things that they took me to task on really are emblematic of the problem, and that's that for most of evangelicalism, um, a literal reading of Genesis is really embedded even in just the presentation of the gospel.
Mhm.
To just really understand, even like, why did Jesus die on the cross? It's, because of Adam and Eve, and and a literal Adam and Eve at that. So like, um, there, and then the whole death before the fall thing, like, how could there have been, death if the, evolution depends on death, and um so how could you accept this if you believe the gospel? So those are, I think it's not really that the gospel requires this, but we, as especially American evangelical Christians, have so intertwined our understanding of what you have to believe to not be an evil evolutionist into our presentation of the gospel, that we can't read things any other way. Like, it's the only that we accept. So
Yeah, I think that's right. I think from my experience, that is the big stumbling block. As far as I can see, all of this creation science, all of the pseudoscience and the distortions that they've created in their books and their articles. To me, that's just it's a camouflage in a sense to keep them rooted in the fundamental problem, which is, if Paul mentions Adam, if the cross is about a literal Adam and Eve, then we couldn't possibly deny this because we'll just be denying what Jesus and what Paul says. And I think, yeah, that to me is, I can convince people of, to some extent, of the scientific errors, but if they just can't get behind, if they can't get past that point, then it's a big struggle, which has always been a curious thing for me, because I I think this a much more enlightening way to look at scripture is to say that, well, it's so far pre-science that it has to stand on its own genius, if you like, by the fact that it's a theological drama, it's a love story, it's an account of God's interaction with creation. Once you accept that science is a very different lens through which we view reality and which we assess reality, it gives me some hope that if people can see it that way, then they won't start confusing the science with the scripture.
mhm.
Yeah, I see a lot of culture intertwining. I mean, it's easy when we're in the evangelical realm, you might say, or whatever lifestyle, to be culturally isolated from so many other cultures. That's, we have our own support groups or social venues. our literature, even our entertainment venues, you know, kind of intertwine. And like Eden said, you know, explain the gospel is so kind of pre-packaged that all these things are set, you know, this way. This is one way to explain it, and because it's easy to explain this way, we've basically used that and it's become our fulcrum, you know, upon which we put the gospel, rather than intellectually. And what I've observed, I think, because of the historical modernism versus fundamentalism split back in the turn of the 1900s, we're intellectually like 100 years behind in grappling with the questions that even the liberals were asking and coming to their conclusions. You know, how should we view Genesis? How should we view Adam and Eve? How do we talk about the meaning of the cross? And in light of what we discover now, you know, over the last 150, 200 years, and we've kind of, because we like certainty as evangelicals, you know, you can know that you're going to heaven. So we like knowing that this is the way we view things, and we're like the certainty there. It's kind of like pulling the rug out from under your feet when you've got all these questions and there's no easy answers, you know.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
like what I said about I just had to put stuff on the back burner for a long time, you know, and like that verse, you know, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. There were just, it's like, okay, I'm not going to walk away from you, but I don't understand how this all adds up. So I just have to leave that with you. And at some point you can make it make sense to me. And, you know, so, so I think there's this transition place for some people, at least for me, where I wasn't really a YEC anymore, but I didn't really accept evolution either. I was just sort of in limbo because I knew that there was big problems with the YEC thing, and yet I wasn't really ready to say that I could accept evolution yet. Um, so, you know, I had to go through that transitional phase until I could really have stuff to hang my hat on and say, okay, now I understand how this works, you know, at least in some way that could make sense to me. So, you know, I think like Martin Luther had like his aha moment of like, you know, the just shall live by faith. For me, the aha moment was that Jubal Cain was the father of all who play the pipe. Um, and you know, because yeah, that was like my aha. Where it was like, wow, no, this is cool. Because what that just opened up for me all of a sudden, it was like, you know what, the scripture talks about so many things in symbolic language. And, you know, if Jesus is the express image of the Father and the fullness of God dwells in him, and Jesus shows up talking, you know, teaching everything in parables, but we think that God the Father only ever spoke literally. Like, and you know, why is that? Like, don't we see the Father when we see Jesus? And so, like, you know, and my now husband was like way ahead of me on this. He like took me to Psalm 78, which opens up by saying, you know, I'm gonna speak in a parable, I'm gonna utter a dark saying, and then it goes through the whole literal history of the nation of Israel. And he's like, so where's the parable? You know, but for me, okay, so Jubal Cain is the father of all who play the pipe. I knew that wasn't literal. I mean, first of all, it's before Noah, right? And but you know, you just can recognize the language. Like when you're not stuck on something, you recognize the language is not literal, right? So when we talk about Abraham being the father of all who live by faith, we don't think that Abraham literally gave birth to everybody who lives by faith, right? And I don't think that Jubal Cain literally was the progenitor, you know, physical progenitor of anyone who plays a flute. Like, so, like, you know, so then I started thinking, well, wait a minute, when it says Eve is the mother of all living, or that, you know, Adam, through Adam's sin entered the world, like maybe this is just the same sort of language. And that's what opened it for me. Like that's all of a sudden, like, I could exist within this whole thing. And even with Paul, like talking about the first Adam and the last Adam, it's like none of us are physically descended from Jesus, but we all
Right.
gain life from the second Adam. So why do we have to be physically descended from this, first Adam guy to have inherited sin?
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
so it opened the whole thing up to me where it's like I could just deal with the scripture in a very different way.
I think the thing about Jubal, for example, can actually be useful. I have 3 kids. My wife and I are musicians. We did music ministry in Spanish for many years. My 3 kids are hardcore gigging musicians, and I mean, I think that passage is saying nothing more than musical ability or artistic ability is often genetically transmitted,
Mm.
and
Do you think
I,
it's talking about
Well,
genetics there, though? I think it's talking
well,
about.
I mean, genetics wasn't a going concern in
no.
those days, but heredity was recognized as a thing.
Yeah. Well, also cultural
Yeah.
fatherhood. You know what I mean? He's the father of all those who were playing instruments like that. Maybe they got the understanding according to their telling of it. They would have gotten the understanding from him, or whatever, or he made it popular or whatever. So
I think
there's,
it meant that he's the first person that really got into playing the flute, right? Like
yeah,
he's the first, so he became the father of people who do this because he set the standard, he set the way. Like sort of like, you could
Mhm.
say that I don't know, Copernicus is the father of people who study astronomy or something. It doesn't
Yeah.
mean that literally the
Mhm.
father of, because I mean, do we really think that the only people on the history of the world that have ever played the flute are direct descendants of the Jubal Cain? Like that, it can't mean that. It just can't. And like I said, it's before Noah anyway, so it.
We're supposed to ask the right questions according to Aristotle. And if the Bible says that these are the birds you're not supposed to eat, don't eat owls, don't eat peregrine falcons, this list of raptors, don't eat the hoopoe, and don't eat the bat. Now, even then, they knew that a bat wasn't a bird, but the Bible wasn't saying bats are birds. The Bible was saying, Torah was saying, don't eat bats. They
Right.
got rabies. They're dangerous. They're not, they're
Mhm.
not kosher. And so you can get the right thing. Uh, I love the example of Nathan confronting David about his sin with a parable about a pet lamb. That's the only pet mentioned in the Bible. And
Mhm.
Nathan's making this up because he's about to bust David for stealing a guy's wife. And he knows how to get to David. We're going to talk about a lamb. This guy's a shepherd. He loves lambs. They are his babies. Um, and he sneaks past David's defense with this made up story about a
Yeah.
lamb. And David gets all angry with the rich man who ate the poor man's lamb. And Nathan says to him, "You are the man." David is now busted. The point isn't that there was a literal lamb or a literal prodigal son or a
Mhm.
literal widow seeking protection from her opponent. The point is that story is used by God, as particularly by Jesus or by the prophets, to tell a greater truth than
Mm.
what happened at the store this morning.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely, absolutely.
Man.
so
Yeah.
I find that useful in life.
Yeah.
It story is the most powerful method of communication, and it's underpinned by the propositional value of truth. Um, and this is what I've said to some of the younger creationists I've been engaging with, is that even if you take just Genesis 1, or even 1 and 1 to 3,
Mhm.
the stories are conveying so much metaphysical power
Mhm.
that to try to rob them of that and just treat them as literal history, it's so absurd. And I think there are some people in my life who are young earth creationists who I get to talk more deeply and personally about this stuff with them. And what it looks like to me, the underpinning thing, the commonality here seems to me to be that these are people, and in a sense it might be a bit of a humble fault too, that they don't want the world to be too complex. They need it to be black and white, and they need to know where they sit on each particular issue. And as Eden said earlier, the reality is such an adventure. The cosmic story of the creation of the universe and the physics and the maths that drives it, and the fact that we're all stardust, and the fact that biological evolution is an astounding story. To think that everything came from single ancestry, and that it developed and evolved into all the amazing creatures in the world. And also to think that actually that's not all good. There are lots of, as Tennyson said, nature red in tooth and claw. It's a pretty brutal business too. But
Yeah.
it's part of the exhilaration of creation and embracing life and saying, well, isn't this fascinating? It's we circumscribe ourselves so much if we just take this very narrow black versus white, and we're afraid to step out into the adventure of reality. It's an exciting story, and to reduce something like Genesis 1 to 3 to something so purely literal and historical, it's so impoverishing.
Well, it's not useful in the propagation of the gospel, because I don't have a problem with somebody choosing to believe something non-scientific about the universe, but when they make that a prerequisite to Christian faith,
Right.
and that is called a stumbling block. My kids, I didn't really have much of a say. They ended up going to Christian schools, and my youngest had huge questions about what she was being taught in school. It was practically Ken Ham stuff, and I was trying to explain to her that there's this is not the gospel. The gospel is, you could call it the kingdom of God, or Christ died to save sinners, but it is not the earth is 6,000 years old. And when go ahead and believe that, but when you use that as an evangelistic tool, you are placing a wildly non-truthful stumbling block in the path of honest seekers. And
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
I run into that all the time, and I used to do it myself. But it just needs to be understood what the gospel is and what it isn't. When we stand in judgment, we're not going to be standing on a trap door with God with his hand on the lever, saying, how old is the universe? 12 billion. Next, that is not, he's going to say either, well done, good and faithful servant, or depart from me, I never knew you. And the age of the universe probably won't enter into the conversation.
Right.
Blake and Tim, I don't know if you've experienced what I would say I've experienced here, but I'm guessing you have, that, your conversations with non-believers take on a totally different flavor when you don't have to try to shove young earth creationism down their throat to talk to them about God. I mean, it's just like, like Jesus came to take down the dividing wall of hostility, between Jew and Gentile and all this stuff. And, but like, I just feel like there's just this dividing wall that Christians approach people with this stuff. And when you don't have to hold that up, it's like all of a sudden, I'm in dialogue with an atheist and they're trying to convince me that, the world was made by evolution and that science matters. And I'm like, yeah, it's like, we're having a conversation for a half hour where we agree on everything. It's so much more fun to share the Lord with someone where you can agree on the ground rules. You can agree on reality to a certain degree already.
I never convinced anybody of the gospel with my evolution, my anti-evolution argument. No one got saved. When people did respond to the message of the gospel, it was because it was our relationship with God and not our take on the age of the universe.
Right. And I think most people respond because it speaks to deeper needs that they have rather than what happened way back in the past. Okay.
You know, much that is hidden, oh Tim.
Yeah.
You're supposed to say quite.
Well, quite. Okay. We'll say quite.
It
All right.
also
Go
it also
ahead.
makes public school like a real viable option in a lot of cases for kids, you know, like I don't have to be terrified. Like I'm realizing that a huge percentage of the terror that a lot of homeschooling families have of sending their kid to their local public school is because they're afraid they're going to learn evolution, you know? And when I'm not afraid of that, it's like, oh, I can judge my local school by a whole different set of metrics to decide if I want to send my kid there, you know?
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, and it's also about trust, isn't it? Because as you've all rightly said, you know, if you're an honest believer who wants to talk to people about your faith, our faith, and firstly, as you say, there's an immediate barrier if you're trying to shoehorn in something that's clearly evidentially false, i.e., you know, anti-evolutionary dogma and a young Earth. But the other thing, of course, is attached to that is that if you are a genuine seeker and you've never had a relationship, an encounter with the Lord, and the person telling you that there's this amazing journey to be on once you know Jesus, and then they're saying, but actually all the science about this is wrong, the Earth's only 6,000 years old and this sort of stuff. How are you supposed to trust that person? Or certainly it's going to be a lot harder to trust that person if they can be so wrong about something so fundamental and also so arrogant as to say, well, scrap the hundreds of years and the tens of thousands of scientists and their achievements and their contributions to society. We can scrap all that as a fundamental precept because actually my literalist interpretation of the Bible is going to trump that. It creates a massive barrier and undermines trust from the start, doesn't it?
Yeah, it makes a big hurdle, like you said.
yeah.
And all of a sudden it's like trying to hit them with a brick. All of a sudden they're saying, "Well, what?" You know. I think it makes it more confusing.
Yeah. I think too for my atheist friends, because yeah, like suddenly I have a lot of atheist friends, you know, it makes the issue much more about faith than about like, you know, some weird set of propositions that I want to like argue. Like, you know, because at the end of the day, it's like, wait a minute, we believe the same thing about, you know, history. We believe the same thing about like Noah's flood story coming from the Epic of Gilgamesh. We believe the same thing about, you know, the, you know, evolution of life on Earth. Like we believe the same thing about the age of the Earth. Like they literally can't hit me with anything. We believe that there's contradictions in the Bible. We believe there's errors in the Bible. Like, you know, and so, you know, and I'm okay with that now. Like I don't need the Bible to be this error-free book for it to be still like a precious document that reveals the gospel and reveals God, you know? So, um, but so, you know, when I'm talking with my atheist friends, there's nothing we disagree on really, except that I believe in God. And all of a sudden it's like, well, wait a minute, how can you believe that if you believe all these other things that I believe, you know, preclude God? And it's like, aha, see, now we're talking. Now I have a mystery to give you. Now I have something that's like about faith, that's about something otherworldly. You know, I'm not trying to base my faith on some weird set of false arguments. Like, you know, let's just talk about God.
Yeah.
You know?
Hmm. Yeah, and I think one thing that we could mention, which is good news, is if you track the history of young Earth creationism and the dialogues that have happened since the sort of 50s and 60s, you know, during those earlier periods, we obviously knew far less than we know now. And since particularly, you know, Francis Collins and the Human Genome Project, I mean, we at this stage, and this is something I think important for all viewers too, is at this stage, you know, we know without any shadow of a doubt that if you map the similarities and differences between any two species, you can place them on a family tree of biological evolution, and you can know which species is more closely related to which other species. And every time we apply this formula to any pair of animals by sequencing the genome, we can confirm how closely related they are in evolution's family tree. You know, this is it's a nested hierarchy of relatedness that is beyond doubt. Now, two things really. Firstly, when you have such strength of evidence and it's so ubiquitous now, you're probably going to find that the people who are continually resisting this are going to go down one of two routes. They're either going to get even more fundamentalist, perhaps like an Answers in Genesis type movement, where they have to cleave to an even stronger dogmatic cult type form in order to keep their people together. Or, as we've said earlier, which I think, as we could acknowledge, does have some merit, that we then have a more sophisticated form of what might be ex-young Earth creationism, which is old Earth creationism in the form of kind of an intelligent design, which isn't entirely without merit because the world is intelligently designed, and it's important, I think, that we can explore some of the mechanisms by which God may have used his creative genius in the evolutionary process. And that takes, of course, us all the way back to the physics of the universe too. So I guess my question for you guys now, and I'll say a bit about the UK in a minute, but from an American perspective, given that, as far as I can tell, the majority of it started in America, it's kind of like America sneezed some young Earth creationism, and we've in the UK we've caught a big cold here too. Do you think, you guys, that given the robust evidence that's impossible to deny with any proper empirical scrutiny, are you seeing hope that people are falling away from young Earth creationism and that evolution starting to become more mainstream in the churches, or does that depend where it is? What do you sense of the landscape over there?
Well, history actually supports or encourages us in that sense, because there was the whole thing with Copernicus and Galileo being told by the church, you know, you need to recant, you can't support a heliocentric solar system. And eventually the church embraced it. Now, it took hundreds of years, maybe, but it did happen. And when I became a Christian in the early 80s, I was not presented with any alternative other than young Earth creationism. Dr. Collins was just in a lab somewhere, and there really weren't very many apologetics that were embracing mainstream science at the time. Now, you had anyone from Billy Graham to C.S. Lewis who would concede that it's possible that God might have used evolution. They weren't diehard YEC people, and yet that fell through the cracks, and I embraced the only, quote, science, unquote, that was available at the time. And I think someone's going to have to pay for that in the long run. But now the trouble is getting my fundamentalist friends to even read Dr. Collins. In Proverbs 18:17, it says, "The first to present his case seems right until another comes and cross-examines him." But these people will not look at the evidence. They compare it to, oh, I don't need to read the Book of Mormon because I know that it was just made up. Completely ignoring the lack of parallels between, say, Mormonism and different threads of actual Orthodox Christianity. So hopefully the evidence will gain traction.
Deconstructionism is like a major movement, at least on the internet. But you know, there's so many people that are going through deconstruction, and those people tend to go one of two ways. Like they either just give up their faith entirely, or you know, some of them may retain some version of Christianity and be you know, okay with throwing aside being YEC. But like I think my hope, my faith in the church getting better on this level kind of um went out the window with COVID. You know, because I just watched people like double down and become like even more science denial people than I've
Yeah,
ever
good point.
heard. And um, you know, it's uh, you know, people who had no trouble getting immunized and getting their kids immunized are now like passionate anti-vaxxers after COVID for some odd reason. Like, you know, so it's, I don't know what to say there. It seems like, at least in the US, it seems like things are going like really either into major disillusionment and deconstruction, that just people lose their faith, with a small minority hanging on with a deconstructed faith where they still have a faith, or it's just the pendulum's the other way, where people are just becoming more and more fundamentalist and more like willing to believe alternative narratives and non-scientific narratives about a whole host of things.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, it's like the pendulum's going,
Yeah.
denying reality, you know. Or if you face reality, but you lack the answers, you know, because of the way the Bible has been presented to us, and it hasn't been grappled with, I think. You know, in the modern evangelical culture right now, it is that reactionary thing. You know, just double down. You have to deny all the science and reality that you know of, and the Bible is true, and that's it, and we're going to double down it. Or like the next generation, seeing the reality of that we see around us, is going to probably break away and just say no. You know, their children are going to college, learning all this, and then all of a sudden there's this clash going on because their parents aren't able to explain this in the light of, you know, what they're seeing. So we need a new look at it and grappling with the questions that they have, right? I mean, people like William Lane Craig and others in the evangelical environment now are at least starting to, you know, academically look at it this way and try to find answers. And I think until we have at least a body of thought that is dealing with that openly, you know, instead of trying to hide the questions or whatever, or just put them down. I think until then, we really won't make any headway becoming or staying relevant, you know, in presenting the gospel to the modern society.
And here's the problem, like I think from a sociological point of view, at least again in the US, I think things might be a little easier in the UK. But in the US, the problem is, where do you go to church? You know, like I'm a charismatic evangelical. I believe in speaking in tongues and prophesying, and you know, I'm a pretty far gone, like, you know, evangelical tribe person. But you know, my entire tribe thinks that I am either they're just willing to put up with the idea that I believe something aberrant in their viewpoint, or I'm really suspect of, having really lost touch with the faith or something. Like my chances of being allowed to minister in certain groups and certain teams have gone down the toilet, for this. So, the question is, where do you go? Where do you turn? Because at least from my point of view, it's not really it doesn't really mesh well with me to go to like a mainline liturgical church. Like that's just not my style of worship. It's not my type of belief system even. Like, I mean, not that they're not Christians, they are, but it's like uh, but they're not going to understand where I'm coming from with, half the things that might come out of my mouth. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so like so I think that's a big challenge to people who, are accepting evolution as Christians, especially if they stay in the evangelical fold or the worship, the charismatic fold, like, is that you're really going to have to be swimming uphill in whatever group you're in.
Mm.
Um, and unless you can really bite off, just completely leaving that behind and you're going to go become Anglican or something, which is fine. But it's just, and I think, again, in the UK, those things mesh a little bit more, like I've seen Anglicanism where people are charismatic and like, in the
Mhm.
UK, like that's very different than in the US. So like, um, there's no, aside from the online groups, it's very hard to find in real life a group of people that are going to be on the wavelength of I got my COVID shot, I was wearing masks, I did IVF, and I accept evolution, and I'm a biology teacher. And by the way, let's go speak in tongues together and prophesy. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
Mm.
Like it's just really hard, you know. So I'm grateful for the people that do put up with me and let me stay in their fold.
Mm. Yeah, I think you've touched on something as well, which is that, and even the UK, this is why I think the conversations are so important, because unfortunately I mean, it's great that the churches are growing in the UK, but the ones that are growing most are the ones where the majority of people do accept young earth creationism. The African churches, they're the Pentecostal churches. So it's great that so many people are coming to Jesus, but yeah, there's a lot of conversation still to have with a lot of Christians, because the ones that are most influential in propagating the faith are unfortunately coming with the baggage of young earth creationism too. So thanks. We've got about 5 minutes left. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I really appreciated what you've got to say. It's been really edifying, and in the last couple of minutes, then 2 or 3 minutes, if I could just ask each of you just to, for anybody listening who's doubtful about the young earth creationism they've been brought up with, that they're struggling with internal dissension, what advice would you give them to explore more rigorously and more courageously? What advice would you give somebody who's listening to this and thinking, yeah, I've got doubts about this, but I don't know where to turn?
Well, I'll shove my oar in. I don't think any of us can deny that all truth is God's truth. So there is nothing to fear. There's nothing to be afraid of. If you suddenly find out one day that the earth revolves around the sun rather than the sun revolves around the earth, Jesus is still Lord. That is not something that can be scientifically disputed. I mean, even the existence of God is not a scientific question. There may be evidence for it or perceived evidence against it, but if you find out that that the bat is not a bird, that should not undermine your faith. All truth is God's truth, and so if you read Dr. Collins' book, The Language of God, and you disagree with it, well, there, at least you might gain some respect for somebody who holds a different perspective than you do. I can respect the young earth creationists, having been one, and because that was the only data that was offered to me for the longest time. It just it behooves us to understand one another, to find out each other's point of view, and to not fear any truth, whether it's scientific truth, spiritual truth, whatever.
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely. Amen to that.
Eden, you were going to say something?
Oh, I was waiting for you, but that's
Oh.
fine. Yeah, so I would say, my charismatic side, I would say, learn to hear God's voice. Because, unexpectedly, as I started learning to hear God's voice, he was a lot more down to earth and a lot more in touch with things that, like, wasn't it's weird because like you're learning to hear God's voice, which sounds kind of magical, but he was like far less magical than I thought he should be. It's like, no, you really do need to like work with things the way they are. And so I think, just trust in the Lord with all your heart, follow the voice of the shepherd. The more you hear the Lord, the more he's going to lead you into all truth, and you don't have to fear where he's going to lead you. But I know we're taught like, don't let him lead you anywhere other than the way you're interpreting the Bible right now. So,
Right.
along those lines, John Walton is usually people's like gateway. If they're very, very fundamentalist, if they're very like, okay, every word of the Bible has to be 100% true, fine. John Walton is your guy. Because he doesn't violate that, but he does teach you how to read. And if you're willing to like step a little bit further, and because you're not quite on that wavelength, then go for some Peter Enns maybe. So, but there's a lot of really good books out there, and there's some really good online communities. There's Celebrating Creation by Natural Selection, which I think all of us are in. And then there's Answers to Answers in Genesis. And there's Evangelicals for Evolutionary Creationism, and there's some really good groups out there that will help you work through questions. As long as they don't think you're there to argue. You'll get kicked out if they think you're there to argue. So.
Right.
Cool. Thank you. That's great.
Well, I think I would just say ditto with Blake and Eden on that there's nothing to fear. I mean, being afraid that maybe the devil's lurking behind wherever I might look outside of the Bible, or, to try to find an explanation for why the Bible says things the way they are, that they say it, right? As opposed to what science seems to be saying. I think we need a little courage, and we need to be open. I think the gospel is strong enough that whatever you throw at it, the edifice will still be there when you're done, and so go ahead and try, take a look and see what is really being said out there,
Yeah. Yeah, and of course the other thing is pray. God, as Blake says, all truth is God's truth, and God is more on our side than even we are. He wants us to know all truth that we are able to cope with more than we do. So if you have doubts, if you have if you have internal struggles about evolution, about how you can reconcile it with your faith, then pray, take it to God and say, please, Lord, show me the whole of your truth, as much of your truth as I can take right now, because I think that's a great pathway in.
And that was
Guys,
a good point right there. As much truth as we can take. Like I mentioned earlier, I began with Dr. Ross's book, which only dealt with the age of the universe, didn't touch on evolution and such. It was my gateway drug to biologos. But
yeah. Oh yeah, biologos. We didn't mention them.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Eden, Blake, Tim, thank you so much. It's been a really good conversation, and I hope the viewers find it as enjoyable and enlightening as I have. Thank you so much for being my guests. I'm James Knight, aka the Philosophical Muser. I'll put some links in the comment in the description below. So, guys, thank you so much, and really good to talk with you. Bless you.
Yes, thank you
Also
very
with
much
you.
for hosting. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.